From the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. I'm joined by Zaid Jilani. He's a freelance journalist. He's actually a contributor to the Washington Examiner and Tablet Magazine. He's also a good friend. Thank you so much for joining us, Zaid.
Great to be here.
So Zaid, there's a lot going on, obviously, post-election. It's almost as if there's this sense that Democrats seem to be more at war with each other than Republicans. And nothing arguably epitomizes that than this House Democratic Caucus call that happened in the days after the 2020 election, in which Virginia Representative Abigail Spanberger, who told her colleagues that calls to defund the police almost cost her election, and then also implored her colleagues, quote, she said, "Don't say socialism ever again." House Speaker Nancy Pelosi sort of rebuffed the rumblings and grumblings among her caucus, saying that Democrats won the presidency and the House, and that they have a quote unquote mandate. First of all, what is the Democratic mandate, assuming that the presidential election results hold and that the Electoral College will vote for Joe Biden for president and he's sworn in on January 20th, 2021?
Yeah, I mean it's a really interesting question because on the one hand, the Democrats largely won the 2020 election. They retained control of the House of Representatives, and it appears that Joe Biden will be the next president. Of course, President Trump is challenging it in basically every way that he can through lawsuits and so on and so forth, but it's very unlikely any of that will succeed. And it seems like Biden is the president-elect, and that will be made official in December when the Electoral College votes. And yet we can see that Democrats don't 100%, they don't feel 100% great about the results. And I think part of the reason for that is that in order to enact their agenda, the Democrats needed a wide kind of legislative majority. They needed enough members, particularly in the U.S. Senate, to survive filibusters, to maybe even change or alter the filibuster to get through big legislation on issues like healthcare, environment, workers' rights, minimum wage, college, education, you name it. With a narrow Senate majority, which doesn't even look like it may not even be in their grasp, because that will rely on two special elections in Georgia, or not special, runoff elections in Georgia in January. Particularly if the Senate is in the hands of Mitch McConnell, it's maintained by Mitch McConnell, it does look like the Democrats really won't be able to do very much with the government. And if they aren't able to do very much with the government, then they're really not achieving what they ultimately set out to do, because it wasn't just displacing Donald Trump. That was just step one, right? They have a legislative agenda, and that legislative agenda requires a certain majority in Congress. Prior to the election, the run-up to the election, if you looked at the polling, it looked like there was a pretty good chance of Democrats doing well in the House, maybe even expanding their majorities a little bit, doing well in the Senate, enough to where they may even capture control of the Senate, and that maybe Joe Biden would win by a large kind of popular vote majority here, like a substantial number of votes that would give him a quote unquote kind of popular mandate among the public. But it didn't turn out that way. If you look at the batch of votes in different states throughout the country, it appears that Joe Biden only narrowly defeated Donald Trump in a number of states. Those narrow victories add up to a decent Electoral College victory that'll be fairly equivalent to what Trump had in 2016. But they don't add up to what we generally think of as a landslide election, the kind of election that would allow the Democrats to reconfigure the U.S. government. I mean, there were senators who wanted to add additional seats to the Supreme Court, who wanted to change or eliminate the filibuster, who wanted to pass sweeping legislation on healthcare, on education, minimum wage, infrastructure, the environment. Now all of that seems basically impossible. And yet we had anticipated for months on end that it would be possible, because the theory was that Trump was so unpopular, the economy had turned down, COVID-19 was raging, that this would have been this massive blue wave election. But it didn't turn out that way. And I think that's ultimately what has Democrats a little bit down, even though there probably is a little bit of relief that they finally defeated Donald Trump, who was the president who drove them, more crazy than they had been in a long time, I'd say.
I mean, considering the outcome of a second Trump term being the worst case scenario for Democrats, with the way things are now, Biden wins the presidency, Democrats lose around 10 to 14 seats in the House, GOP retains the Senate. could this be considered at least within the top 3 worst case scenarios for Democrats?
I think it could be, particularly if you think about what's going to happen over the next 4, 6, 8 years. One of the areas where the Republicans actually expanded their reach a little bit was in state legislatures. There was a number of places where they actually gained power, increased their foothold. And what this does is it gives them greater power redistricting
Hmm.
for like state legislative seats, for congressional seats going past the census year, which means that this will actually probably increase their power in the House in 2022. Now, in midterm elections, typically the president's party loses seats anyway. I don't think all the congressional elections are done yet. Sadly, in this country, sometimes it takes a long time to count, as we've noticed. So we don't know exactly what the Democratic margin is going to be there, but it could be very, very thin. We could be talking about Democrats only having to lose, 12 or 13 seats or something in 2022 for the Republicans to regain control of the House. The Republicans gain control of the House, they will stop all partisan legislation. They'll probably start up investigations of the White House and the administration, as they often do. And they'll probably be nicely set up to run for president again in 2024. Without kind of a wide majority and a strong public mandate from the public, the Democrats are not necessarily in a great political position for the next few years. And it may also be the possibility that the Republicans bring someone to power in their presidential primary that is a bit more capable than Donald Trump, but also, can tap into some of the popular themes that work for him, but also can maintain some of the decorum or diplomatic attitudes, or have some changes to his or her personality that allow them to expand a little bit beyond what Trump's coalition was. Because really, if you look at Trump's coalition, it did actually work for the Republican Party in many parts of the country. It only needed to really be expanded a little bit in order to capture the majorities needed to attain power. So,
Yeah, there are obviously a couple of people that come to mind. You have Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, who's actually pretty populist when it comes to big tech censorship. And then you have Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas, who's been, um, I think, in the early part of his Senate career, was very hawkish on things like Iran, and it seemed like he was very neoconservative. But sort of, in the Trump era, I would argue that he's probably drifted more towards a populist. Line of thinking, especially when it comes to things like immigration, and I think they're obviously way more diplomatic than Trump is, considering what the establishment has offered versus what Trump and Trumpism offers. Um, but yeah, those things definitely stand out as problematic for Democrats. Um, but one aspect that really stuck out to me while analyzing the data from the election results is how, as you mentioned, President Trump actually expanded his base. Um, but this in particular with minority voters, we're looking at blacks, Latinos, Asians. According to the Washington Post, in particular, Trump's support increased with black voters by 4 points nationally from 2016, with Hispanics and Latinos also 4 points, Asians 7 points, and other, considering, I mean, what other, racial or ethnic demographic, by 5 points. It's given him a 5 point bump in net non-white voters. If you dive even deeper into the numbers, he went up with white women by 3 points, black men by 6 points, black women by 6 points, Hispanic and Latino men by 4 points, and Hispanic and Latina Hispanic and Latina women by 5 points. The main area, obviously, where Trump lost support is with white men. He lost 1 percentage point, which is, I guess, where Biden increased his support by 7 points, and that obviously seemed to be, barring any the voting irregularities and voter fraud, and it's hard to envision that Trump actually can get to the point where he overturns the results of the election. But uh, things aren't officially over until the electoral college votes.
right.
But in your view, with this bump in Trump's support and his base expanding with minority voters, how did this happen?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think that the Democrats tell a story, and I think even the people who've told this story have offered some nuance to it over the years. So it's not quite this simple, but basically, they say that demographics are destiny, right? That as the white share of the US population declines, this will naturally benefit the Democratic Party as more Asians, Latinos, African Americans, indigenous folks end up voting for the Democratic Party because the Republican Party cannot attract those people or increasingly is losing them. The problem with that theory is that it turns out that when you have a group that goes from an out group, meaning it's kind of small, it has a more marginal position in society, to an in group, meaning that it's actually getting more success, it's in more positions of power, tends to be more integrated and mixed, and the nature changes. They tend to integrate their politics, right? They tend to actually fit more neatly into the political system rather than just being a small outgroup that maybe is clustered in one political party or ideology or cultural niche. So, you can look at that as the history of, even within the history of like US context, like Catholics and Irish, right, were one group that was once very marginalized in US society, now is kind of wide, interspersed, has quite a presence in more than one political party, so on and so forth. And I think that's a lot of what you'll see with a lot of these other minority groups and immigrant groups, is that as they become more mainstream in US society, they'll feel more free, they'll feel more empowered to be themselves, to explore different types of ways of being, because they won't feel like they can only vote for one political party to pursue their interests, because they'll have a variety of interests.
Yeah.
The more power you gain in society, the more you have a place where you can actually invent yourself and choose your own way, the more other options are appealing to you. Now, I think part of the reason this happened in this election was that if you look at the past 3 or 4 years, prior to COVID-19 primarily, the economy was actually pretty good on the lower end, of the spectrum. So I think you had very good job and wage growth among African American communities. You had very good job wage growth among many Latino American communities. And I think that probably did earn a little bit of good favor for the Trump administration, enough to increase their numbers a little bit. On top of that, you did have the Trump administration very strongly push criminal justice reform through the First Step Act. They made it a big part of their campaign. They made it a big part of their campaign advertising. They did it through Super Bowl ads. And I think you had a very strong kind of Latino outreach program by the Trump campaign as well. I think if you looked at a lot of what they were doing in Florida, for instance, it actually reminded me a lot of what Obama did there in 2012. I recall Obama using musical caravans, the campaign using musical caravans in certain minority communities in Florida. And then I think in the lead up to the election, you could see a song that they were using in the
Yeah.
Trump campaign, like a Spanish language song. And
Yeah,
people were dancing and like,
it was a banger too. It was
yeah,
that song slapped.
they understood the culture that they were dealing with, I guess is what I'm saying, and that many times Republicans don't even try in a lot of these communities. Like, they have a very weak outreach program, whereas the Trump campaign did have a real outreach, I think, arm doing this work, which is important, because the first step is showing up. So I think if you combine all those factors, one, the structural changes that these groups are becoming largely are in groups in parts of the country. Two, there was a strong economy for a lot of those folks. And then three, I think you had some issue focused and issue based outreach. That was really important for the campaigns to do that. Maybe in the past, Republicans weren't as aggressive in that direction. So I think with all that put together, even with a leader at the top who often is very impolitic or rude or vulgar, alienating those bases in some ways, you still had some surprising performance there for the Republican Party. And it does suggest that going forward, if the Republicans carefully calibrate both their rhetoric and their policy, they do have a base they can grow within these portions of the population, right? These are not no man's land for them, right? They do have some ability to actually build out an electorate in these populations and be competitive with the Democrats, particularly among Hispanic voters, I think, but also in an African American population that I think is diversifying in terms of its own politics.
Yeah, I was seeing. I think originally it was a CNN exit poll in Florida that support for Trump among Latinos and Latinas went up at least by a significant number of double digits. I don't know if it was like in the 40th percentile or something like that, but it was up there, and it's kind of interesting because like you look at sort of how messaging works in certain parts of the country. Obviously, the response to that was particularly from Democrats and thought leaders on the left, thinking about how Latinos and Latinas didn't like vote with their group. Like they expected them to be more monolithic in their beliefs, and it's simply not that way. Like, for example, in Florida, you have the Trump campaign messaging that Biden is basically a Trojan horse for socialism, knowing that full well that many Cuban exiles and Cuban Americans with a very, vivid recollection of Fidel Castro's regime and his rise to power, and the communist regime in Cuba and how they've sort of clamped down on all aspects of society. They didn't want that, but it also didn't work in places like Texas, where you're having most Hispanics and Latinas are actually from Mexico and Central America. So it's just there's like a sweeping generalization there that I feel like is sort of the epitome of where or how Democrats view their Latino base.
I mean, let's remember something. Like, Latinos are the largest minority group in the United States now. I mean, it's something like, I don't know, 18 or 19% of people in the United States are from Latino or Hispanic background. That's such a massive group of people that at this point they are linguistically diverse, they're culturally diverse. Tend to have, as you mentioned, they have differing ancestry, and also they're becoming increasingly culturally and politically diverse. I think that it's very interesting to see that in states like Texas, in some border counties, you have a more conservative Latino population. Now, I think in parts of California, you're going to see a more liberal Latino population,
Right.
and the reason why is not that complicated. I mean, in Texas, you have a more conservative political culture as a whole. In California, you have a more liberal political culture as a whole. And as people live together and work together and become friends, I mean, I know it doesn't look that way on Twitter sometimes, but
Yeah.
people actually do tend to interact with people who they disagree with all the time, and they change over a matter of months or years. They tend to change their minds or soften their view towards something or harden their view towards something else. And particularly as they become integrated, because like I said, when you're a small minority group who's kind of clustered in one place, it's easy for you to have more homogenous ideological or political views or cultural views. But when you're 18 or 19% of the population, you're rapidly integrating into every part of American life. Not only are you going to change American society a little bit, but I think American society will change you.
Yeah.
And your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, what you read, your religious beliefs. Because also another thing I think Democrats may fail to see sometimes is that Latinos and African Americans tend to be much more religious than liberal white Americans in particular, right? Like they're much more secular. So all these things matter. And when we're talking about such huge groups of people, you are going to see a lot of differences. And I think that's something I hope that media people and reporters will work on in the future in the way they describe these people. And actually, 538.com had a really good article about this, where they looked into they used a bunch of surveys to see like what do African Americans believe, and they concluded the article by saying there really is no such thing as the black vote, because actually it's actually a fairly diverse group of people. Yes, it's partisan leaning, it's Democrat, but within that group of people, there's all kinds of beliefs. There's huge divides by age. Everybody divides by gender, religiosity, ideology, and to really understand this group of people, you have to understand it's not a monolithic group, right?
Yeah.
It's a collection of all different types of cultures, of ideologies, and of just people who are in different parts of the country. And I think it's a testament to living in such a big, beautiful, diverse country that happens to be the case. So
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Do you think that this was due to the efforts of Trump and the GOP and their campaign to expand their base to minority voters, or was it something that Democrats did to drive them away?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. So I do think, as I mentioned earlier, the Trump campaign actually did work pretty hard on minority outreach in a way you don't normally see with a Republican candidate. And I do think that mattered. And I think that the state of the economy really did matter as well. A good friend of mine, Daniel Marins at the Huffington Post, he's a reporter. He was in the Philadelphia area around the election, and he talked to someone who used to work at the Dominican Republic consulate or embassy. And they told them, I've never spoken to so many Dominicans who said they were going to vote Republican, but the reason why is because, they felt like they were getting jobs, right? They felt like things were going good in their businesses under Trump. And so I think that matters. But I think it's also important to note that I think parts of the Democratic coalition have become very left wing in some social and cultural dimensions. that don't necessarily appeal to the rest of the population. So, for instance, there's been all this debate about defunding police. Joe Biden himself does not support defunding police. He has said it a number of times. It's not in his plans, and it's primarily a local and state issue. It's not even a federal issue for the most part, other than some grants that the federal government uses and gives to police departments.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, we're in a time where politics is so nationalized, where one candidate's point of view does not really represent a political party. The loudest voices in that political party can often be used to represent that party, right?
Right.
So somebody may think rationally, it's a completely rational thing to think, okay, if I'm voting for Joe Biden, that kind of means that I'm empowering the side that has a Bernie Sanders who's a socialist. I'm empowering the side who has Ocasio-Cortez who wants to defund the police. It's much more likely that those people will have his ear, that they will get positions in the government, they'll get cabinet spots, they'll get legislation through, if I vote for Joe Biden. Some people were thinking that, and it's a completely rational thing to think that even if Joe Biden himself doesn't hold some of these views, his party does, and they will influence him in the future, particularly how old he is. He may not even run for a second term, and maybe
Right.
somebody else will run next term. So I think that because of that, some of the more kind of extreme social views on the Democratic side have come to represent the party. I mean, Ruben Gallego, who's a veteran Hispanic member of Congress, he said that, a lot of Democrats have used terminology for Latino voters that they themselves do not use, like
Yeah.
the phrase, the word Latinx, which is supposed to be a gender neutral word for Latino or Latina, which is funny because there already kind of is one. You just say Latin, but
Yeah.
they made a new word out of it.
or Latinx, as some people like
Right.
to to sort of condescend the phrase.
I mean, even
or mock it.
Elizabeth Warren, when she was running for president, said that word on a debate stage. Now, it's not a surprise to me that she earned almost no votes from that community if you look at the exit polling,
Yeah.
because she didn't know how to talk to it, right?
Yeah.
It's not a monolithic community by any means, but if you look at the surveys, I think maybe 2 or 3% of people within that community use that word. So, like, it's just not a huge base of people.
Yeah, and
But
in fact, it's like imposing, English onto another language, or
well, I can imagine if they did it for Urdu, right? Like, they would replace the word for boy and girl with some word we have never heard of. Like, we
with
would feel
beta and beti, it would be like bet X.
we would feel very confused by that. We'd be like, why are you doing that?
Yeah.
But I found it very interesting that Ruben did that tweet thread about this because it suggests that he saw this in action, right, among
Yeah.
voters. Like he would see that confusion and consternation about just using bizarre, out of touch language with
Right.
voters like that. So I think, I do think it was a combination of both of those factors. I think that, I do think that the Democrats themselves were often treating these voter blocks as having much more niche cultural and social views than they actually did have.
Yeah.
And because of that, they were not as responsive to a lot of what the Democrats were saying, right? They may have been more responsive to what a Joe Biden was saying, but Joe Biden was in a party coalition that includes a lot of people who do those kinds of things. And, it is somewhat rational for a voter to say, well, I'm at least empowering that side or giving them more power,
Yeah.
even if I vote for Biden. So.
Yeah, and it's also fascinating to see, like the Andrew Yangs, obviously the Spambergers and the Connor Lambs of the world, who you argue are probably more representative of the Democratic Party because AOC is in the D+29 district in New York, and she can say whatever she wants. She's going to get elected or reelected, which she has. I mean, everybody was trying to primary her or run as a Republican candidate, but there was absolutely no way she was going to lose in 2020. Just she is a face of the Democratic Party. She's not going away anytime soon. Ultimately, she's going to vie for power. I mean, the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has already pledged that she's not going to run for House Speaker in 2022. Maybe she's seeing the writing on the wall, knowing that the House is not going to, or the Democrats are not going to take control of the House, as you mentioned earlier in the show. But it could open up the floodgates for sort of the progressive left wing of the Democratic Party to seize the castle or storm the castle and take control of the Democratic Party that may be ripe for ideological picking.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see what will happen in the future because you have to understand that traditionally speaking, the Democrats have relied on a band of people in swing districts in order to maintain power. So those are districts like the Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, like Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, Central Virginia, like Katie Porter's district in Orange County type area in California, some districts in Georgia, in Texas, Florida. The people in those districts are terrified of having someone like Ocasio-Cortez represent the Democratic Party in their messaging. And if you look at the GOP attack ads at people in swing districts, they barely talked about the actual people who are running
Right.
there. I mean, they did, but like the trick was to associate them with less popular people. So they would have ads featuring defund the police. They would have ads featuring Bernie Sanders. They have ads featuring Ocasio-Cortez. The idea was to tell voters, if you vote for the Connor Lambs of the world, they will help the Ocasio-Cortezes seize power because they're in the same party. They help them get votes, they help them get committee chairs, they help them get the White House, help them make appointments, help shape legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And it is somewhat of a fair argument, although somewhat unfair in the sense that, like, if too many of these moderates lose power, but the Democrats maintain power, it could just result in a House Democratic caucus that's more left wing because it doesn't have the moderates there. Although it's also true that if the Democrats lose so much power that the Republicans take control of the House in 2022, then it doesn't really matter anyway, right? Like, then Ocasio-Cortez gets much less power anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's that aspect, but also, within, and this is sort of how people have looked at the 2020 election, and that is, if say like if Joe Biden ends up, say for example, Trump ends up winning, in the very unlikely scenario that he say whether they're able to prove that there's massive voter fraud, or the Electoral College ends up, you have a bunch of faithless electors that end up voting for Trump anyways. Do you envision sort of a scenario where the far left wing of the party, the progressives, the Bernie Sanders and the AOC say, see, I told you, neoliberal policies don't work. You have to fully embrace democratic socialism or socialism as a whole in order to win elections. You have to defund the police. You have to pass Medicare for all, increase, minimum wage, pass the Green New Deal, all those things. Or else Democrats are never going to get power.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because there are parts of what they're saying which I think are legitimately true. Like, it is true that parts of the Democratic Party are just seen as way too much captured by elites, tend to be people in Wall Street, tend to be people in Silicon Valley or Hollywood or whatever. This part of the critique by the Democratic Party left, I think, resonates not only with progressive leaning people, but it resonates with a lot of people in the middle. A lot of like rural conservatives, I think, would probably also agree that Wall Street has too much power for the Democratic Party. But the problem is they've fused this more popular set of their beliefs with a more extreme social agenda in the past 4 or 5 years. So like defunding the police is not popular, right? It's extremely unpopular. In fact, I believe it's probably one of the things that alienated Hispanic voters the most, because if you look at the polling, they tend to be particularly averse to that, which I think makes a lot of sense, particularly if you look at the fact this tends to be a more downscale community and they need the police, right? Like if you live in Beverly Hills, you don't really need the police very much, right?
Right.
Maybe you have a gated mansion, maybe you have private security. But if you live in El Paso, you probably really do need the police. Like, it's very important for you to keep you safe from criminals, from robbers, gangs, drug lords, etc. Like, this is an important capacity for your society, for your community to have. So I think by marrying the more popular economic agenda with the unpopular social agenda, and then even framing parts of the popular economic agenda with unpopular framing, like socialism is unpopular. Like, people don't like the phrase socialism. They associate it, as you mentioned earlier, with things like Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, Soviet Union. Even when really much of what Bernie Sanders is talking about is just like having a child care program like you might have in a city like New York, or having a healthcare program like you might have in Sweden, or something like we have in Medicare in the United States. They've chosen very unpopular framing for a lot of their policies that should be popular on the economic side, and they've adopted very unpopular and extreme things on the social agenda side. And when you combine all that together, I think it makes it very difficult for them to get the numbers to actually seize power in the Democratic Party. But ironically, they're still being used in all these Republican Party attack ads and in messaging
Hmm.
to where they're weighing down the people like Joe Biden who don't even agree with them on most of these topics. It's a very kind of rough situation for that wing of the party to be in. And I think if you look at the appointments that Joe Biden's making, so far they're really not winning. He's
You mean
appointing,
the progressive wing of the party is not winning?
yeah, the progressive wing of the party is really not winning, at least on the like legislative side. Like, they would want what they want on universal health care, what they want on breaking up Wall Street and banks in Silicon Valley, what they want on topics like climate. It doesn't look like they'll be able to achieve any of that because they just don't have the numbers there, right?
Yeah.
The people who are in those swing districts are the ones who make the numbers to get a majority. And right now, all those people are on like life support, right?
Yeah.
Many of them came very close to losing elections. And if in 2022, if they do lose elections, then, Kevin McCarthy or whoever the Republicans make their leader at that point will be in charge of the House of Representatives again, and then they certainly won't be getting what they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just I don't see the progressives totally being able to take over right now, but they do have a large enough platform or soapbox to represent the Democratic Party to a lot of the public. It's just that a lot of what they represent isn't popular enough to boost their numbers.
Um, Shifting gears a little bit, there was an op-ed written by Wajah Ali in the New York Times about reaching out to Trump supporters, saying that it didn't work. And if you read the piece, it comes off as him trying to convince Trump supporters why they're wrong without actually trying to understand why they feel the way they do about certain issues. There's a line in particular that stood out where he wrote near the end of the piece, quote, "Just as in 2016, I don't need Trump supporters to be humiliated to feel great again. I want them to have health insurance, decent paying jobs, and security for their family. I do not want them to suffer, but I also refuse to spend any more time trying to understand and help the architects of my oppression," end quote. Obviously, he's referencing the oppression in the sense of Muslim Americans being oppressed. But you basically rebuked this idea basically a week before this was even published in Tablet Magazine, where you discussed the many ways in which Muslims not only survived in the Trump era, but thrived. Um, how is this even possible, basically, when everyone in the elite liberal circles and the media elite are telling the rest of the country that we're oppressed?
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think if you roll back the clock to 2015, particularly 2016, I think there was a lot of merit to this idea that Muslims were going to have it really rough in the United States for the next few years. You had a presidential candidate, Trump, who did use a lot of really acerbic rhetoric, who made extreme policy calls towards Muslims, his campaign surrogates as well, like Newt Gingrich. But I think once he actually got into office, so there's actually something that changed. It was very interesting. So Shibli Talhami is at Brookings Institution at the University of Maryland. He did a whole lot of surveys and polling. And what he found was that over the course of the 2016 election, Muslims actually became much more popular in America, right? More people said they had a favorable view of Islam and Muslims. Muslims themselves said that they were getting people who were telling them that they're basically offering them support for being Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
And over the next 4 years, opinions of Islam and Muslims continued to improve. Like Americans became much friendlier towards Muslims. Many more Muslims were featured in arts and entertainment, on television. People like Wajah Ali got a column in the New York Times. And by the time you got to the 2020 election, there basically was no Islamophobia in the main components of the election. You may have seen it in one ad here or there in some race,
Yeah, I mean,
so
not
on and
only
so
a
forth.
call from the
But
New York Times, but also CNN. I mean, he was a contributor for them. I mean,
it,
there was an infamous segment of him with Rick Wilson and Don Lemon making fun of Trump supporters in particular at the
Yeah,
beginning of this year.
it's very funny that Rick Wilson went from using Muslim imagery and ads to defeat Democrats, which he did to my senator in Georgia in 2002, which he superimposed, a photo of Osama bin Laden or a video of him with Max
Right.
Cleland. It's very funny that Rick Wilson went from that to now dehumanizing a different group of people with a Muslim on his side. So Rick Wilson always finds a way to be on top, I guess.
Yeah.
But I guess my point was that I think it was entirely rational for people to be very concerned and worried in 2015, 2016. But in the 4 years since, overall, things got much better for Muslim Americans. People like us much more. We have much more presence in arts, culture, entertainment, media, business, and we have also much more presence in the government. There are a lot more Muslim Americans serving government, like a huge number more serving government in like even the state where I live, Virginia. I think there was maybe one serving in Virginia government or in the legislature a few years ago,
Ghazala
and now
Hashmi. Ghazala Hashmi.
exactly.
I know that because she shares the same last name as me, even though we're not related. But
There
everybody
you
was
go.
assuming.
And now there's I think I don't know there's maybe a 8 or 9 or 10 or maybe more than a dozen. Like I'd have to check after the
It's
most
definitely
recent
grown
election.
for sure.
Yeah, I'd have to check after the most recent election because in the most recent election the numbers grew even more all over the country. So I think what happened was Americans were presented with certainly a ton of Islamophobia during that period, 2015, 2016. They saw it and they rejected it. For the most part, they rejected it. They decided they didn't want to go that way. Even Trump himself kind of pivoted away from it and he barely mentioned it anymore after a few years of being elected because ultimately Trump's a businessman. He wants to sell a product. He doesn't. I don't think he has any deep ideological conviction about this, and Americans weren't buying that product. It
Mhm.
was a great test of seeing exactly how tolerant this country is. Now, I'm not arguing the country is perfect. There certainly is bigotry, intolerance in the country. There were hate crimes during this period, but overall, it was a good stress test of our society because it proved that Americans are much more fundamentally tolerant than we often give them credit for.
Mhm.
They actually closed ranks around Muslims, and virtually every segment of society grew more favorable towards Muslims. And second, Muslims are more fundamentally resilient than we're giving credit for. I don't think most of us would say we were quote unquote oppressed over the past 4 years, right? Like
Oh, for sure.
nobody at any level has oppressed me over the past 4 years, and I'm not at Wajahat's level of income or fame either, right?
Yeah,
Um, I'm not an Uyghur in China, right? I'm
exactly.
not a refugee in Syria or Lebanon.
We're not
Uh,
Rohingya. We're
we're
definitely
not
not.
Rohingya. Those people are all in the category of oppressed. Now,
We're not in
certainly,
Yemen. I mean,
yeah,
there's
I'm
a lot
sure,
of bad situations around the
right?
world where Muslims are being oppressed, for sure.
Absolutely, and it doesn't mean that our lives are perfect. I mean, yes, occasionally someone has sent me a nasty email or something, and so on and so forth. But overall, my life has been pretty good being in this country. And I
Yeah.
think it's really funny. I wrote another article for Persuasion, which is Yasha Monk's Substack. I think it was a couple months ago, and I went through a bunch of polling data, and you'd find that most Muslims say they're proud to be an American. Like more than 9 out of 10 say they're proud to be American. Most of them are very happy with their lives. They feel like their lives are improving, right? If you survey Muslims themselves, they're very optimistic about the country, right? I think they saw the same thing that I noticed in the Tablet magazine article, which is that Americans Americans showed a real, I think, willingness to examine Islamophobia and then reject it, right? To examine the nature and the fundamental characteristics of Muslims here in America and to embrace them. I mean, what
Hmm.
we're seeing in France right now, I think, is a good example. In France, there's almost like a clash of civilizations or something, right? The French don't let Muslim women wear headscarves in public places, right? Like schools or government
Yeah.
buildings, right? In America, I can't imagine even the most extreme right people doing that. And the reason we can't is because our entire system of government is set up to accept people like us. Our First Amendment would prohibit the government from ever doing that. And I don't think Americans are in any rush to change that. We have our problems. We obviously have conflicts. The person who did the worst for our reputation, of course, was Osama bin Laden
Exactly.
with the 9/11 attacks. He did he tried his best to convince Americans that we're all like him. But Americans took a look at the evidence and overall came to the conclusion that we're not. And I think that's a really good commentary on Americans, and it's very good for us. And
Yeah, I know there's one particular point in your article on Tablet Magazine that the concern for terrorism went down from it fell from 16% in December 2015. This is uh, around the time of the San Bernardino terrorist attack. ISIS was still on rampaging across the globe. You had also the Paris terrorist attack a month prior to that. And also in December 2015, this is right in the wake of the San Bernardino terrorist attack. You had then candidate Donald Trump announce that he wanted to ban Muslims from entering the United States, a move that he tried to implement in the first almost immediately after he was sworn into office in January 2017. And you see basically entire country react in a way that they rallied around Muslims. And
I don't remember where I was coming back from. Maybe it was a vacation. I got to Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. I saw, I don't know, 100 people or something with signs saying, "We love Muslims, you're welcome here," so on and so forth. In my entire life, I had never seen a group of
Yeah.
Americans just standing around saying, "We love Muslims." Like, we, like, come on over. Like,
Yeah.
and I almost got a little emotional seeing them. Like, how do these people doing this? I never would have imagined anyone would be doing this. But
Yeah.
that was actually representative of what the median American was thinking. Most Americans, they looked at that and they didn't like that. They didn't want to see a religious minority singled out that way.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think that the 16% to the 1%,
Yeah. It
that
dropped
comes
to 1% in February 2020.
I think that comes from a Gallup poll where they were showing, what do you think are the most important problems in America? Now, most people in America aren't even thinking about Islamic terrorism. They're not
It's
thinking about
crazy.
that. They're thinking about how do we get a vaccine for this virus? How do I make sure our businesses come back that have been destroyed in this unfortunate pandemic? They're not thinking about Muslims. They're not obsessed with this, right? Americans were scared after terror attacks, and like that's
Hmm.
understandable. Okay, terror
Absolutely.
attacks are scary. Like I understand why when people are running airplanes into your buildings, why wouldn't you be scared?
I mean,
But
I think for you and
you
me,
know,
we were also scared because obviously
we were scared too. Yeah.
Muslims are just as much of a target, if not more so, than say any
I mean,
American or
look,
Westerner.
Pakistan lost tens of thousands of people to terror attacks from Al Qaeda and the Taliban since 9/11, right?
Hmm.
When they came into Pakistan from Afghanistan and they did all that. Yeah, we understand what it's like, right? And we were scared too. But I think that the hopeful thing is that after the initial wave of fear, people were willing to get cooler heads, and cooler heads prevailed. I think people were willing to see that we are not the same thing as Osama bin Laden. And unfortunately, I think in some parts of the world they were not able to see that as well.
Yeah.
I think in parts of Europe, for instance, Muslims are having a very rough time because many Europeans are thinking, why are we even bringing these people in? It's too much of a hassle. These terror attacks are really driving them up the wall. And here in America, I think we've gone over that hill, right? We hit it. We had a wave of tons of fear in the United States. We had this Islamophobia that came about, but we let it pass. We breathed our way through it, right? We
Yeah.
we didn't let the panic attack seize control of us as much as it could have. It could have been much, much worse. And I think ultimately that's why I feel grateful to be here. And I think if Wajahat searches inside, he'll also feel grateful. But unfortunately, the brand in the media that works best for you right now is to say you're a victim of something, right? To
Right.
say that, you are so persecuted that you deserve this perch or platform to speak out, and that people should feel sorry for you and give you prestige and access, which I don't like. I mean, when I do that, I feel like I'm taking away from someone who really is a victim, right? I don't
Hmm.
want to. I don't want to do the Juicy Smollett thing, right? Like where I'm getting all cameras on me when I prefer the camera would be on the people who are really suffering because then we could do something about it.
Yeah.
I can't imagine anything I could do for Wajahat. He has fame and money. I mean, what am I going to do for him? Like send him a Christmas tree? I mean, he doesn't celebrate Christmas, so that won't even work. So I don't know what I can do for him.
Send them a
I'd rather
PS5.
I'd rather hear from a Uyghur or someone to write an op-ed in the New York Times, tell me what
Yeah.
I can do for them, right?
Exactly.
Or anybody who's suffering. But it's just not us right now. Not most of us ended up doing pretty well.
Yeah, I mean,
And
it was actually probably a great time to be Muslim. And I think also you referenced the show Rami, in which,
mm,
I think in the first season, Muhammad is, he's operating a diner, and I'm trying to find the exact quote. Oh, this is great. So he said, you're right. There's a scene from the first season where a Muslim diner owner named Mo sees his restaurant defaced by hateful graffiti. He says, quote, "It couldn't come at a better time. Ramadan and hate crime? My God, I couldn't pay for that kind of publicity. This is great. Look at this place. It's jamming." Like that is essentially what it's been like to be a Muslim over the last 4 years in the Trump era, is that anything bad that happens to you, immediate sympathy from virtually everyone in the public. It's insane.
it really is, and it's remarkable that it almost seems like we're traveling the same path as other minority groups in America. Because I think, for instance, when John Kennedy was running for president, BUS JFK, he faced all these like terrible rumors that he would actually be working for the Pope,
Yeah,
that
right.
he would have an allegiance to the Catholic Church, not to the Constitution or whatever. And I think all of that hate and the bigotry and suspicion and intolerance, it alerted Americans to the reality of what it was like to be Catholic in America. And Americans closed ranks. And now JFK is like one of our most popular ex-presidents. He's like a legend, right? Like people memorialize him and talk about how great of a speaker he was and how inspirational he was. It flipped the script because I almost feel like you have to go through a hazing process in America to be accepted. Like every single group has to hit a wall at some point. But once you're through the wall, it's great. It's like people have come to the realization that we're just as American as everyone else, and now like it's gonna be smooth coasting from here. Now I don't think that means we'll never have any problems again. I mean, there may be, and who, God forbid, there is another terrible terrorist attack by Al Qaeda or ISIS or something.
God forbid.
And maybe we'll face a little bit of that, but I think we'll face it stronger than we were before.
Yeah.
Because now we are more accepted as citizens. We're in more perches and places of power. We have more, I think, social capital in this society and more of a stake and a foothold in society than we did before. So I think we'll be able to manage it better than we would have in the past. And I really do feel optimistic about our place in America, because I think we almost survived one of the more ultimate tests out there. So
shifting gears back a little bit to focusing on the Trump presidency, I found a very interesting aspect is that when President Trump would give these political gifts to Democrats, the Dems would always find a way to fumble whatever it is that he gave them somehow. In my view, I mean, their reaction was almost always over the top and ended up garnering more public sympathy for Trump as it would for Democrats in a very similar way. It was, we were just discussing with the Muslim American community that, say, if Donald Trump or anyone who hated Muslims would malign Muslims, people would rally around behind the person being maligned. It's almost like that with Democrats. The Democrats would malign Trump, and a bunch of people would just rally around Trump and strengthen his support even more. I mean, how much? I mean, first of all, is that a fair assessment? And secondly, how much has that really played a role in sort of leading to this outcome of the 2020 election?
yeah, I mean, I think that something the Democrats didn't quite understand is that Trump's personal character, or the way that he carries himself in terms of the things he says, the way he interacts with people, it is off-putting to maybe the median American, but they're not like traumatized by it or anything, right? Like I think there's such a gap there's a huge gap. The biggest gap in American politics that's growing right now is like college education. And people who are college educated or have been to graduate school or post-grad, they tend to have a different way of conducting themselves in terms of the way they speak to people, the kind of humor they enjoy, the adherence to certain, what they call political correctness or social norms. Trump does away with a lot of that, and often he overdoes it and ends up alienating people. But often he may say something that's like clearly a joke, and the way Democrats would react to that would be like, this is a threat to democracy, or putting everybody in peril. And it's like, not really. Like, the guy's riffing, right? Like, he has a sort of Howard Stern shock jock personality that he uses as entertainment occasionally. And I think a lot of Americans would recognize it and interpret it as that. And the Democrats would go five car alarm, 5 fire alarm, DEFCON 5, whatever you want to call it.
Five alarm blaze.
5 alarm blaze, right? And they would overreact so strongly that it would kind of make them look kind of humorless or just reactionary. And I think they did that also with some of the more mild scandals like Russia stuff. Like they overplayed or overstepped the claims they were making about Russia with the election, to where a lot of Americans probably just got bored of it, or they felt like it was just politicized, right?
Yeah.
So I think there were a number of times like that where actually it probably made Trump a little bit more sympathetic in the eyes of a lot of Americans, particularly when like unpopular institutions are piling on you. And one of those is the news media. Like the big cable news networks are not popular among Americans. Like if CNN and MSNBC and everyone's blasting Trump every day, sometimes it may be like, okay, well, maybe Trump's standing up to some of these like rich, elite, powerful people who I also distrust, right?
Yeah.
Now, ultimately, I think a lot of what Trump just did with respect to the economy, COVID-19, the way he presents himself, probably didn't do himself any favors, because people can judge him they don't have to judge him through the prism of CNN and MSNBC. They can just see him speak, and they can see the outcomes of what he did or didn't do on COVID-19, the economy, or healthcare. And I think, that did ultimately hurt him. Like he needed to be more attentive, I think, to policy than he was. It's okay. I think it probably was okay for him to be the shock jock entertainer type guy at his rallies or whatever. And probably could have managed with that, but I think there was just probably too much 3 a.m. rage tweeting at Joe
Yeah.
Scarborough, and like, at some point, a president actually has to like take the mantle of leadership, and that goes back to what we were saying with Watch Out Hut. Like,
Yeah.
if you present yourself as a victim, okay, you're a victim, but why should you be the leader then, right? Like, the leader needs to be a strong person who doesn't have to worry about taking care of themselves. They're there to take care of everybody else. If you're presenting yourself as just a victim of all these other forces, okay, maybe I'll feel sorry for you. And sometimes I do think the media overdid it against Trump and were unfair to him, but that doesn't mean I think he's a good leader. A good leader shouldn't be about drawing sympathy to himself. It should be about drawing sympathy to other people and producing for them and, making the world better for everybody else. And I think that's a really unfortunate pathology that's taken root in American elites, is that American elites at every level, whether they're newspaper columnists or CEOs or presidents, they tend to have realized that this kind of stolen valor of pretending you're a much bigger victim than you are is something they can use for power.
Yeah.
Because it has a certain cash among other elites who also bought into the system of thinking. But I think among a lot of ordinary Americans, they're just thinking, why is someone who's a cable news contributor, why is the president of the United States telling me how hard they have it? Like, I have it hard. Like, I can't make my bills. My son's in Afghanistan. Why are they telling me how hard they have it?
Yeah.
And I think ultimately that's probably what hurt. That was probably the least presidential part about Trump, I would have to say. Like, I'm not someone,
Trump was definitely his own worst enemy. And
right.
but like that sort of extends to sort of like this woke oppression Olympics that we currently have. I mean, I started mocking it just by saying something that literally any criticism of me online would be literally Islamophobia, just because it's like if everything is considered racist, sexist, what have you, bigotry, like, then nothing is. It just doesn't go that way. And and people who are watering down all these definitions of what things should and shouldn't be, what is prejudice, what is not prejudice, what is bigotry, what is not, it really starts to get people get desensitized to it.
I mean, people have to understand where the roots of why these things were a problem. The roots of why these things were a problem is because they denied people opportunities. They separated people from each other. They made people second-class citizens, right? You didn't have voting rights. You couldn't eat in the same diner as somebody. You didn't have job opportunities. You were denied the access to healthcare and to, government subsidies for housing. These were the roots of why these things were a problem. If you're a rich and famous person, you're doing very well in life, and maybe someone makes an offhand comment to you, yeah, maybe that person's a jerk, but it's not like the root of the problem of inequality in America. It's not the Jim Crow system or like apartheid or like, we have to focus on, I think what we really need to focus on is reducing the kind of prejudice that's denying people opportunities. And that's usually not just somebody who says an offhand comment or who's a jerk one time. Which is, even if you're the most rich and famous person in the world, you may encounter that. Like, if you're an athlete or something, maybe you'll encounter someone at Waffle House or someone who says something like that's not really where my attention is focused. My attention is focused on, is there a mother in rural South Carolina who, in her community, she can't get Medicaid access, and she has cancer, or she can't work a job that gives her flexible enough hours to spend time with her kids, or and maybe bigotry or racism is part of why those things are happening. Maybe she's facing job discrimination or something. But like, I'm actually trying to look at the outcomes for people. I don't want these things to be reduced to something where you almost want you almost want to be that victim so you can claim some kind of power, right? Nobody should want to be those things. It's not a desirable thing, right? It's an undesirable thing. So we should locate those undesirable things and deal with them, but not make them up where they don't exist, or stretch the definitions of things so that we'll start putting them in places where they're not.
Apologies to everyone who was probably could overhear a phone call being sent in. Just wrapping up here real quick, because going forward, we talk about how Democrats are really facing a lot of adversity going forward, politically speaking, not just in any other scenario. But what lessons do you think Democrats will learn from the 2020 election? I mean, what roles do you think Democratic socialism and Republican nationalist populism, or just nationalist, or just populism in general, will play going forward? And how much do you think each party will change?
Look, I think realignments, and obviously Sagar and Jetty, that's his thing, it's his podcast. So
Yeah,
he's
the
really good on
realignment. Yep.
he's good on tracking that. But realignments are hard to track and predict, but they definitely happen, right? I think 10 years ago, if I told you that Ohio would be a solid red state, and that huge portion of the working class there would be Republican, you'd say, Zed, you're crazy. Like, that's not that's not how Ohio votes. That's not at all. It's always going to be a swing state, and they're always going to be fighting over working voters there. So we have no idea what will happen 10 years from now. But I do think there is a cleavage in society that's very obvious, and it's probably going to be the cleavage upon which a lot of politics rotates around, which is college education.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas Piketty, the economist, has a paper called Brahmin Left, Merchant Right. And he sees this in the United States, United Kingdom, and France. And all three countries, center-left parties are no longer becoming the parties of workers. That's not their constituent base. Their constituent base is people who went to college. And so I'm curious to see whether that increases and becomes the grand new cleavage in American politics, where Democrats are all campaigning to eliminate student debt,
Mm-hmm.
pay for people's college, and the Republicans, are talking about industrial policy and manufacturing and hard skills and trade schools and vocational programs, which I think would be an improvement of the Republican Party right now, because as one writer in the National Review recently put it, the Republican Party's policies right now are basically making the corporations and rich people who hate them richer with their tax and deregulatory policies. So I'd be interested in seeing if people who are more thoughtful about this, like Josh Hawley or Marco Rubio, or maybe a little bit Mitt Romney, who are saying America needs more industrial policy. We need to have a focus on workers. We need to stop just thinking about the bottom line at Nike or Google or Facebook or Microsoft. Because that would be a viable way for the Republican Party to expand some of the gains they made this year. They made gains among mostly people who didn't go to college, among people who have small businesses who are angry about lockdowns, who wanted a more viable worker support during this whole COVID-19 thing. Those are the people they're increasingly gaining, and the people they're increasingly losing are the people who have grad degrees or post-grad degrees, and they have they have views about various cultural issues that align very closely with the elites in the Democratic Party. The question is whether the Republican Party can decide to go more all in, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, they kind of have a toe in both pools because they haven't adjusted too many of their policies from the Bush era. Only a few of them, maybe on trade in some dimensions, and maybe they got a little less hawkish about like Social Security and Medicare. So the question is, can the Republican Party truly move towards a workers' party? And does the Democratic Party want to become and want to stay the higher education party? Do they want to be a party that's going to ship $1 trillion towards student loans rather than towards child poverty, right? Like, is that something they're comfortable doing? Because it is moving in that direction. And of course, they'll probably end up somewhere in between for both of them, because they both kind of want the other's constituency in close elections. So,
in many ways, I mean, as you have written in the Examiner piece, that both parties are out of sync. And from what you're telling me, it sounds like that trend's just going to continue based on how they're trying to get.
I think if any party can appeal to people who are a little bit more socially moderate and maybe a little bit more fiscally liberal, they could have hegemony, right? If there was a party that was like strongly affiliated with like reforming police but not defunding them, much more support for childcare, and much more support for at least getting a college education. Maybe we won't pay off all your debts, increasing wages, doing some industrial policy, a lot of public spending on building jobs. And it was willing to be a little bit like, we're not going to build a huge wall with Mexico, but we'll control immigration. We will have border security, and we maybe won't completely ban abortion, but we will be a little bit flexible on like late-term abortion. We'll have some restrictions. If a party was willing to kind of be moderate in that social cultural sphere and be a little bit more aggressive in terms of doing more for people who are a little bit, I think, downscale in the economy, I think that party could actually get like a strong majority and hegemony. But right now, the two parties are not in that space. They're kind of both grabbing piles of that, right? So that kind of puts them in this split government position.
Yeah, well, you kind of see the results of that with this election. But Zaid Jilani, freelance journalist as well as a contributor to the Washington Examiner and Tablet Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Raj.